I am so conservative.
Rationalize in my head. These are things I read in
And
the
I'm going to talk about Willow Creek.
Okay.
Willow Creek, a few years back, had
I
invited...
remembered at the time when Will Rogers said, I don't belong to any organized religion. I'm a Baptist.
Yeah. I am so conservative. If you didn't jump to conclusions, you might not get any exercise. I am so conservative.
Welcome to the Unknown Webcast. This is just a bit of a trigger warning for those who believe words are more injurious than sticks and stones. I really am so conservative, I can't turn left even when I'm driving.
Even.
In addition to giving trigger warnings to our viewers, Ron Hensel and I both drink coffee for your protection. This week, Bill Honsberger, a missionary to the New Age with Haven Ministries, joins us to discuss the paganization of the church. My name is Don Vino. I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. In Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast. And our senior researcher is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of today's webcast. And here is Ronnie, baby.
Yeah, I don't think I show this enough, do I? That I drink coffee for your protection. I consider it a public service when I drink coffee.
It is, and it makes me feel safe. Besides,
I think it should make everybody feel safe. Greetings from sunny Florida, where the palm tree came out, saw its shadow, and now we have 12 more months of summer. Our sponsor for this edition of the Unknown Webcast is My Bible, guaranteed the most comfortable Bible you'll ever own. My Bible, our regular legal disclaimer. Our guest on today's webcast, insert name here, Bill Honsberger, has no connection whatsoever to any of the satirical content of the Unknown Webcast, hereafter known as the webcast, although we probably will not mention it again. The satirical content includes any and all commercials, end credits, puns, smart remarks, or anything else that might fall under the definition of satire. In the meantime, Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. bears no liability for or any responsibility for anyone's opinions regarding this satirical content. Our regular notices: the opinions expressed on this webcast are ours and should be yours too. If this annoys you, or if you really like it, to ensure your continued access to this program, please go to midwestoutreach.org, click the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. And as you do, never fear, this webcast is Y2K compliant. And don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite video channels. And now our guest for this edition, Bill Honsberger, ladies and gentlemen. We have the fake applause. Yes,
that is so sincere. I so appreciate that.
Yeah, we used to actually fake the fake applause, and now we have genuine fake applause.
Hey, one correction, Don. When I was with the Conservative Baptists for 9 years, I was their missionary to the New Age. But Haven is a broader mission than that. We talk to everybody who's foolish enough to talk to us.
And
atheists, Muslims, Buddhists, you name it, we talk to them.
And we have everybody. It's a coincidence because we have everyone on our webcast who's foolish enough to come on.
There we go.
So, yeah. Well, and you know what? I have to talk to Bill because he pays me to be his friend. So.
Ongoing, in fact. That's not a problem.
Yeah. Hey, you've been falling behind in your installments, Bill, but Don wants me to let you know. I'm his collection agent.
Yeah. Well, Bill is oh my, you are the vice president of Evangelical Mission Center.
Yeah, I get the big salary too.
Yeah. Well, we doubled it this year.
Just keep adding those zeros, man. I'm going to the bank.
And he will be presenting a workshop actually on the same subject at the EM&R conference, Engage 2023.
I should have that applause. We should
discipleship. Pardon?
I'll send you the applause audio file so you can attach it to that, and every time you bring it up, we can.
Yeah, exactly. So that will be April 28 and 29, 2023 in Tallahassee, Florida, at Lakeview Baptist Church. Go to the EM&R website, look at all of the speakers and schedule and all that sort of stuff. It is free will offering, so we're trying to make it as simple as possible because the church needs help. So, and Bill will be presenting there.
It's interesting, Don, you bring that up, the failed discipleship. It's a semi-joke, but it's true. But when I started as a missionary to the New Age, for example, Don and I were at the Paganicon in Minneapolis a week and a half ago. And the thing about it, for 20 plus years, I've been talking to witches. The first 20 years I was talking to witches, every witch I talked to was a former Southern Baptist, every single one. To which point, of course, I had to rip my SBC friends. Hey, what the heck is going on here? And the great overwhelming majority of New Agers call themselves psychics or Scientologists, you name the fill in the blank, Eckankar, all these different groups, all were former Christians, 99%. Okay. A couple of atheists, a handful of Jews, and everybody else was some sort of Christian. To the point where I've always made a terrible joke out of this, that if the pastors were doing their job, by that I mean discipling, I would not have a job. I would not be a missionary because there'd be nobody to talk to. Everybody would be so serious about their faith. But because we have not done our jobs, we have not discipled properly, then former witch or former Christian now is a witch, now is a psychic, now is Eckankar, now is Mormon or whatever. We haven't done our job. Not at all.
I would say that's true that we haven't done our job. I would say that even if we did our job, these people would still be here. We probably have fewer of them, my guess is.
Yeah, certainly. And we've pointed out in the past, if you read the New Testament, what you discover in short order, if you actually pay attention, is nearly all of it was written to refute heresy, expose false teachers and bad behavior, and call the church back to a solid biblical faith. The same is true of the Old Testament with the nation of Israel. They continually wandered into various kinds of paganism. So this is not anything, but it is depressing to see it on such a large level across the world.
Well, this is the issue with Shlomo and Solomon in the Old Testament, right? They didn't tear out the temple. They just opened up the Holy of Holies to all the guys, Dagon, Moloch, and all the rest of the Baals,
Yeah.
It's this mix that's always gone on. And Jeremiah addresses this in chapter 2, the broken cisterns that hold no water, that people are worshiping, again, it's the constant theme of the prophets, how the people of Israel have turned away from God. And now we get to post-Jesus church times, and it's nothing new. It's human beings at their finest.
It's always going to be a given, apparently. I mean, we see this in the book of Revelation, in the letters to the 7 churches, that among the people of God, there is going to be stuff that causes the nations to blaspheme. This is, I think, from Isaiah, from his words, that the fact that, in other words, we know there's the wheat and the tares are mixed in together at all times. What really irritates God is when the tares are in the leadership, and they are once that happens, that's when you begin to see the terrible things that lead to the Gentiles, the unbelievers, the pagans around us blaspheming the name of the Lord.
So, right.
Now, we should say, by the way, that this is a pre-recorded program, just for those who are watching so that they know we're not trying to sneak something by them. But I felt like we had to pre-record this one so that I could be long distance away once it actually runs. So, no, I'm on my way to speak at the Evangelical Press Association convention, and so we're good with that. Carl Teichler did an article for us about a previous Paganicon he was at, and he wrote this. Workshop that he was in, he says, reinforce something I would hear more than once, that many who formerly identified as Christians now follow pagan paths. For example, during a Saturday panel, question was raised as to which religious affiliations people held before joining the ranks of neo-pagans. Methodists, Baptists, Lutherans, Catholics, Presbyterians, Pentecostals, Orthodox, and missionary. Heads around the room nodded in affirmation. In fact, it was acknowledged that a relatively new movement was being born, Christo-paganism, an intentional cross-pollination of Christian teachings with pagan practices and beliefs.
Yeah.
This is what we're talking about, Bill?
Well, that's exactly what I was trying to say before. And when I introduced the Paganization of the American Church seminar last year, I basically addressed the point that everything I've been seeing in the psychic fairs for now going for 32 years, everything I've seen in the psychic fairs is in the Christian church. Every single practice, belief, idea is inside the Christian church, having been so-called baptized into the church. All this is a way of saying what Carl was saying. So when you talk to pagans, again, I'll take the first 20 years, but even some of the witches we talked to at Paganacon this time, I nicknamed them Christian witches, although I shouldn't say that because you can go to websites and find Christian witchcrafts formally, but in the sense that these people, the older generation was raised Christian, blew that off for all varying reasons, and now are pagans. But the problem is, paganism doesn't give you what you want. Paganism, and I always do this with my classes, paganism never teaches you to love your neighbor. If your morality comes from nature, and because the divine is in nature, which is kind of the bedrock belief of all pagan groups, nature does not teach you to love your neighbor. Nature teaches you to eat your neighbor, especially if they're old and slow. But they can't go there. The older generation can't go there because they were raised as Christians. So they have this, what I call Christian hangover, where they still hang on to some of these basic Christian, we ought to take care of the poor, we ought to be nice to them, we shouldn't murder or rape. Whereas the newer pagans, and this is something interesting that Don and I got to see at Paganacon this time, the newer pagans, you know what? They're going old school. They're going OG. Old school pagans, I was talking to somebody today about the Norse gods, because of the stupid Marvel movies, everything is coming back. Well, you know what? The old pagans understood what nature was, and that's why they killed. The scholars call this sacred death, sacred sex, sacred dance, sacred death, which is why you can find sacrifice all over the ancient world, because they were consistent with nature, right? So now the newer pagans are basically the younger generation are being more honest about it, more consistent about what this actually means. If you're going to say nature is your guide and the divine anime, chi, ki, prana, whatever you want to call it, is in nature, fine. So when you watch Animal Planet for 5 minutes, what do you see? If you go on YouTube, there's a gazillion videos that people have made entire huge subscription service, channels out of, showing snakes eating frogs and frogs eating, rabbits, and on and on and on, with all this examples of nature doing what nature does. So if that's your guide for morality, you're going to wear it, you're going to own it, you're going to have to eat it up. And so I think the younger pagans are getting all over this kind of stuff, and they're starting to see the inconsistency. Don, you remember years ago, I sent you an article. We talked about this not too long ago, but I sent you an article called Sacred Abortion.
Right. And you said you're going to send it to me because you still have it.
I did send it to you.
Back when? I haven't received it since we met.
It several months ago when we talked about this. I'll send it again because you're being a problem child, Don. Anyways.
That's my job.
Okay. Sacred Abortion came out of the Beltane Papers, which is a very popular witchcraft magazine in the 1990s. It's out of print now, but this whole article, Sacred Abortion, is basically summarizing and returning abortion into a religious ritual so that we can get past the guilt. We'll light some candles. We'll bring a channeler in to channel the baby, blah, 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 do all these sacred sounds. And at the end, the pseudonym, the author uses a pseudonym, basically says we have to quit embracing the, holism, meaning life affirming. There's too many people on the planet. What we need to do is instead embrace the holistic wisdom of Mother Kali, Kali Ma, out of India, the goddess of destruction and death. That all you have to do is look at any picture the Hindus draw of Kali and you see what I'm talking about. We have to embrace Kali to be completely holistic ourselves. And I'm like, this is a move right back to old school paganism. This is hardcore. We need to bring sacred death back into the into the mainstay, as it were. So that was 20 years ago when that article came out. And now we have younger pagans out there, again, talking to the young man I was talking to today, the Norse gods, because of the Marvel movies, are so exciting and everything. And yeah, you know how you got into Valhalla? You slaughtered, and you died while you're slaughtering nature at its finest. And so that's old school paganism. And I think there's a real move towards moving paganism off its roots. So why did I say this is new? Sorry to rant on this, guys, but one of the things that was brand new for me, and I've been talking to witches a long time, goddess worshippers, neo-pagans, whatever they call themselves, all of a sudden the Satanists are part of the big happy pagan family now, which they haven't been for my entire time of talking to witches. I've listened to Starhawk and listened to Phyllis Corral and all these big name witches. And Satanists were those bad people way over there. But here and now we're talking to witches. No, Satanists are part, they're in the fold, and we do hexes. We call out spells calling for Donald Trump's death or Kavanaugh's death or something like that. Wow, used to be we only cast spells for good stuff, for, you know, the environment or for personal protection or whatever. Now we're seeing like the dark side coming back, and they're happy, you know, happy little campers with the Satanists now. Just learned that at Paganacon this last week.
Is that why the latest images of Hindu goddess of death Kali look like Hillary Clinton a little bit, or you know?
I want to be on record here. I did not say that. And if I found dead, I did not commit suicide. Thank you very much.
You know what? As long as we're going to talk about Kali and paganism and Christo-paganism, at the parliament we're at, I think in Toronto, we had a Baptist minister draw this. I think you'll be intrigued. Bill has seen this, but he may have forgotten. What are we seeing there, Bill?
That's the one.
That was done by a Baptist.
That was done by a Baptist.
Why am I not shocked? Bad art. Oh,
Who's
sorry.
Yeah, well, Kali always looks different. You know, I've seen pictures of Kali where like photographic almost, and some living woman has actually superimposed her face, or maybe she went in blue makeup. And
she's got the heads of the senators who voted for Kavanaugh.
I see.
Yeah. And again, Kali is always pictured this way. She's so bad in the old Hindu story, she even kills her boyfriend Shiva, who's normally considered the destroyer.
But she's very useful for political purposes, though, right?
Yeah, I would say so.
Oh man, I was at a Hindu satsang downtown Denver many years ago, and they had a picture of Jesus on the table and a picture of Ganesha, the elephant head god, on the table, and they were singing songs of praise to Kali Ma, Kali our mother. We need to return to the wisdom of Kali our mother. And I'm telling my staff, do you guys realize what they're saying here? We need to get back to the wisdom. Same thing as in our article, Don. We need to get back to the wisdom. What is the wisdom? You slaughter in order to make the goddess happy, in order to make Kali Ma happy.
Right. And one of the things, if I recall that article, one of the things that she said, because she was having guilt issues over considering abortion, but she managed to make contact with the child in the womb, and then discovered that it was her mother who had come to visit, her deceased mother had come to visit for a while, but didn't want to be born.
Yeah, you need a scorecard to keep track of the whole thing.
So maybe she's basically using this to work out her mommy issues, is what's going on.
Unborn baby is actually mom who doesn't want to stay. So at some point after a short conversation, she says, "It's okay to kill me now because I just wanted to visit."
Yeah,
and you can use that cranial method. No, forget it.
So it's easy though to look at that as a Christian and say, well, wait a minute, that's a Wiccan, that's outside, that's not Christian. So how does that fit into the paganization of the church? What does that look like?
We should start probably with what it means to be pagan, right? And the simplest definition that again I give my classes, that pagan beliefs everywhere in the world, whatever you call them, have the same central motif, that everything in the universe and everything in the world is in fact divine. And they have the old-fashioned religious called it the anime or the Vital or Elan. The Japanese called it Ki, the Chinese called it Chi, the Hindus call it Prana. All these different ideas of the fact that the divine is in the created order. So when you worship, say you take the Eleusinian Mysteries, very famous pagan group outside of the Eleusinian fields in Greece that Caesar himself went to, and they would have a big sex orgy and all the sex, drugs, and ancient rock and roll you can have. And at the height of the mystery, they revealed the central part of the mystery. Brace yourselves. If you're from Iowa or Nebraska, you'll get into this. It was an ear of corn. Because the belief was by participating in the rituals, you are literally activating the divine thing that fills the universe and fills the corn crop so that you'll have a good corn crop. Or you'll get the fish to come back, or you get the volcano to overflow, or with the Azteca, you get the sun to come back the next day because you hold up the heart. So scholars call these things fertility religions, nature religions, different nicknames for the same idea that we are cooperating with nature. They bring up three things: sacred sex. So when you have sex with a temple prostitute in Corinth, for example, is that just for having sex? Well, I'm sure that was a part of it, but much bigger was to make sure that the city would prosper, that the trade routes would prosper, that the water would be safe. And it was about being a good citizen because you're helping nature cooperate with you.
Yeah.
And so paganization in the old-fashioned sense revolved around that. Again, if sacred sex wasn't giving you a good corn crop, then you go to sacred dance. And you take the ghost dance of the Lakota Sioux or a zillion others, example, trance dancing in, voodoo and culture. And if that doesn't work, you fall back on, you up the ante and you fall back on the big dog, which is sacred death. To slaughter your children, to slaughter somebody else's children.
Moloch,
yeah, everything, in order to get cooperation with nature back in line.
Yeah.
So that's old school paganism, all right? And it has many, string along ideas that you can tell the future by, the goat entrails, or by throwing rocks, or throwing sticks, or there's a zillion varieties of, testing the stars. There's a zillion varieties of connection with the fact that all these things are part of the divine order, right?
So is new school paganism like playing a country song backwards? So you get your, you get your wife back, you get your dog back, you get your job back. Okay.
I bury Dolly. Oh, I'm sorry, I heard that all the time. So that's the old school stuff, right? And along comes the church to mess it up. Here's the first witch I talked to at a psychic fair down in Colorado Springs. This is 1991. And he made this analogy, very interesting thing to think about. He said, and they're still making the connection, which they've stopped now, which is fun. But they were making the connection back then that they were rebirthing, or as it is, coming back with the same good old ideas that the pagan world was. So he said it this way. He said, Christianity drove us out, but now that the church is leaving, we're coming back out again. To which I made the analogy, it's like, when the light is on, the cockroaches are hiding. And when the light's turned off, they all come out again. Now, again, they've dropped this idea that this is ancient pagan thought. But they are saying, in fact, one of the prominent teachers at Paganacon just said this a week and a half ago, and I actually agreed with her. She said, that whole connection with old school stuff, we have to be honest with historians. It's not true. But it doesn't matter. Why? Because just like we're making it up now, they were making it up back then. Absolutely. You were all just making it up.
She literally said that.
She did.
That we're making this up.
I agree with her. Because again, if you watched PBS 20 years ago, the Burning Times, about the witches and how all this nonsense about how Christians hate women, they hate witches, they killed them in Salem, they killed them, by the 9 million was the number that was thrown around for so many years. And Cynthia Eller, who herself is a goddess, person and historian and scholar, she basically said, this is not true. We're making stuff up. And so they kind of moved away from that connection now. So the PBS series is never shown anymore. And this kind of stuff.
Of course, they issued
still spreading.
They issued a formal apology, of course, for.
I'm still waiting.
Okay.
Well, and you mentioned Paganacon 2023, which we were at, and we met a druid. Kind of fun.
Wait a second. Not just your standard druid, John.
Pardon?
He wasn't just your standard druid.
No, I was going to say that Jean Drum Pagano.
Not standard issue? Okay.
Jean Drum Pagano, and he is a member of the Reformed Druids of North America.
I saw that sign. I got a picture, and I sent a text while we were talking to Jean. I sent a text to my pastor who's more Reformed than I, as it were. And I said, look, we found Reformed people here at Paganacon. He's like, what? I said, Reformed Druids.
I was wondering when they'd have a Reformation. I think yeah.
Well, so what was interesting, that's the blog we did last week was on this, is he was pretty straightforward. He said, as we were talking to him, he's very entertaining, very interesting to talk to.
Nice guy.
Willing to disagree agreeably, so we found that good. We did manage to get the gospel to him a couple of times, but he said that when he goes to teach on Druidism and paganism, he takes a box with him that has it's labeled the history of paganism, and then when he starts to teach, he says everything we know about old paganism is in this box, and he opens it up and it's empty because we don't know anything about paganism and how it was practiced or carried out.
Really, we don't. I mean, don't we have any information?
Yes, we do. This is where I challenge him. If the box to be more accurate, should be how we as modern Druids are connected to old school paganism, and the box would be empty.
Oh, okay.
We do know a lot about ancient pagans.
We know there were human sacrifices in Europe.
And I'll give you a story, my own academic little thing. The first class I took on history, I was divided between history and philosophy, which way to go with my PhD. And I took a class at the University of Nebraska, my first year in graduate school there. And the big class, it was a reading class, and it was over a guy had to read the book The Golden Bough by James Frazer, very famous scholar of 130 years ago or so now. And he was like the go-to guy for ancient religions. And his book, just basically documents sacred sex and sacred dance and sacred death everywhere in the world. So now 20 years later, almost 20 years later, I'm taking grad school at DU, the University of Denver. And James Frazer's an idiot who had no idea what he was talking about. He made this stuff out of thin air. Why? Because the goddess movement, especially Professor Gimbutas at UCLA and all these characters, had basically made this huge move in the late 90s that the ancient world was peaceful and wonderful. It was like Avatar. Everybody hugged trees. There was no rape, no crime, no war until those evil, characters showed up. But in the Gimbutas version, the ancient world was peaceful and nonviolent, and everybody respected women, blah, blah, until that evil Middle Eastern god showed up, the male god showed up, and that destroyed everything. This went on for years. Does
he make an exception for like the American continents? Because
she lies through her teeth. She was caught faking. She's an archaeologist, a mytho-archaeologist, whatever you want to call her, like Elsa Campbell. But she shows pictures in her stuff about all these female goddess figures that are very obviously female, although today I guess we couldn't tell what they are. But just 20 years ago.
What's a woman? I mean,
yeah, no kidding. 20 years ago, she would show all these pictures. What didn't come out in all the magazines that were promoting her stuff is that same dig had hundreds of male gods, just like you see everywhere in the pagan world, male gods, but she omitted that. So it's a fallacy of omission. She omitted all that relevant information to show how the ancient world only worshipped the goddess. Now, this is a crock, but I actually had one of my professors that I actually really love and respect, my Hinduism professor at DU. And she talked about the fact that the Aryan peoples, whoever they were, Russians, Greeks, nobody knows who they were, that invaded India, some 1500 years BC or whatever, set up a racist caste system that would last for thousands of years, that they were invited in, that they didn't actually invade India, they were invited in. And I'm like, I raised my hand and go, so let me get this straight. So you're saying now that a people invite their conquerors in because there was no violence in the ancient world, right? How could you possibly make that case? Who does this? But I had a Muslim guy tell me that about France too. Oh, the Muslims were invited in.
Yeah, that's why Charles Martel fought that battle.
Yeah. So this is on, but now it's dead. Nobody's taking Gimbutas seriously anymore, and they're having to acknowledge that we find these ancient Azteca ruins, Maya ruins, we find the ancient Druid ruins. We're finding examples of massive numbers of people that were sacrificed to make the gods happy, to make nature work, to stop the opposing army and stuff like this. So it's now come back to some sense of reality about what paganism really was. But again, I find that corresponding move with the newer, younger generation of pagans, that if you're going to worship nature, well, this is what it looks like.
So let's move into the church. All of that so far, we're just covering pagans outside the church, technically outside the church, or Christians who have left the church and gotten involved with paganism. In 2001, our friend Dr. Peter Jones did his book, Pagans in the Pews, trying to alert pastors and churches, here's what's going on. Here's what you have sitting in your pews. And I think relatively few paid attention to that.
Of course.
A few years later, a young man named Aaron Nyquist, who had been the worship leader at Rob Bell's Mars Hills Church, moved to Willow Creek Community Church. And shortly after he started there, on his personal page, he posted this statement that Richard Rohr has revolutionized his view of the Christian faith. I know Bill Honsberger was somewhat concerned about that. Why, Bill, would you be concerned about that?
Let me see, because Richard Rohr, whatever one thinks of the Catholic Church, and I'll leave that on the side for a second, Richard Rohr is an apostate by Catholic definition, Orthodox definition, biblical definition. I don't care what definition you want to use. Richard Rohr, I was following him for years down in New Mexico because some of my professors at DU and other places, even at Denver Seminary, were going down to Richard Rohr's conferences in New Mexico and stuff like this. And Richard Rohr had a conference, We Are God. Well, that's subtle. That's about as subtle as you get.
You want to flesh that out for us?
Yeah, he's terrible. And when I did this seminar last year, I did this whole thing on Richard Rohr. So I made the dubious researching choice, Ron, you'll appreciate this. of taking his daily devotion for 6 months solid.
No.
You know, and you want
Yeah.
to take a bath with a, you know, with a steam hose after that.
Yeah.
But of course, he had all the people that love him, Brian McLaren and
Rob Bell,
and just, you know, host of the progressive, emerging back then, host of the emerging crowd who loved Rod, Father Richard Rohr. And so Rohr is, I guess to me, he's the modern version of Teilhard de Chardin, who was openly, you know, embracing Shiva worship as part of what it means to be a good Catholic. We must embrace Shiva, and on and on and on. And this is Richard Rohr as well. So the universe is Christ's body. So Jesus has come back in Christ's body. This whole universe is in fact Christ. So see the connection with the pagan idea that the universe itself is divine. And in his case, it's the body of Christ. So he's just taking a very old pagan idea, putting some Christian, you know, verbiage around it, and it has captivated younger people. I have met so many people who have walked away from their faith, abandoned their faith altogether, because they became big fans of Richard Rohr.
Now, he does reference the Bible quite often.
Oh, yeah.
I'm trying to get you to really understand what it really means. And we have a sponsor that has a Richard Rohr type approach to the Bible.
Well, yeah, it's very interesting. I should probably do this in a Mike Lindell kind of voice, right? I don't know. You know, we all know that awkward feeling when someone in a Bible study says, I wish the Bible didn't have all those verses about hell. Or when you're having couples devotions and your spouse says, I'm just not comfortable with verses that teach a traditional view of marriage. Or when you're sitting in a church and you're thinking, why do all the Bibles I read always have to agree with what conservative pastors are teaching? That's why we're introducing My Bible. It's guaranteed the most comfortable Bible you'll ever own. We've spent literally minutes creating a way you can have a Bible that's perfect for you. You used to have to go down some dark back alley to get a Bible like this, but not anymore. Just write down all the places where you want to make your Bible more comfortable for you, and then email them to us or enter them into our handy online form. And the results speak for themselves. Yolanda from Portland says, now that I have my Bible, I never worry that my white male pastor sermons might actually be right. Ben from seminary says, my Bible gave me the confidence I need to drop out of my Hebrew and Greek classes. And Renee from Madison says, every single one of my anti-capitalist, anti-police, and anti-social protest chants now comes from my Bible. So when someone throws an uncomfortable verse at you, you can say, that's not in my Bible, available at mybible.cult. So, you know, get that thing, use that handy online form, Bill. And,
I was just watching a debate with so-called LGBTQ scholar Brendan. What is his name?
I look at him and Brendan Fraser. No, he looks like a sonogram to me.
He looks awful, but he was debating Jeff Durbin and James White relatively recently, and basically his response to everything they threw up was, I don't think that's in the text. I mean, I'm just paraphrasing. Almost every statement he made is that wasn't in the text. That was added later. Right. He just plays that card over and over again to the certain point when you realize this is the religion of Brandon, who has my Bible.
I'm thinking of the Brendan Fraser,
one of your best customers.
Right. So that's infecting the rest of not the rest, but many in the church.
You know, Francis Schaeffer said it 60 years ago, Don, I believe, that inerrancy is the watershed issue of the church. Well, look at us today. Look at us literally today. When you have enormous numbers of Andy Stanley recently, big pastor in Dallas, you know, I can't even count all the mega church pastors that have come out and said, one of them just said this last week, that anybody who says that God has a problem with transphobia does not believe in the God of the Bible. Wow. Any guy who says that
God is transphobic or agrees with a transphobic,
you have to agree with a transgender general, or you're literally, in fact, he actually said it this way: you are committing the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. You are committing the unforgivable sin.
I think the person may have committed that himself just by saying that. It's hard to say.
I think he said it a long time before that. This is the issue. If you don't believe that the Bible is the Word of God, you have to. I'm going to go Nietzsche for a second here. Why would you bother believing any of this stuff? Why would you still call yourself a Christian once you've taken all the miracles and all the stuff that you don't like out of the Bible? And that's where we are today. So to go back to the original question, you wanted to bring it back into the church. So, for example, you can find tarot cards in the church. You can find crystals in the church. You can find aromatherapy in the church. You can find the labyrinths in the church. You can find Buddhist chanting in the church. I can go on and on. Literally everything I see at the psychic fairs. And Don has done such a great job, Don and Marcia, with the Enneagram. I've been around the Enneagram for 30 plus years. Nobody cares in New Age. It's old school. It's boring.
Right.
You know, but all of a sudden it explodes into the church, and it's the hottest new thing that, you know, develop our faith and our relationship with God. I'm like, what? I remember when Don told me this, I was freaking out. How could this thing, of all the things in the New Age, take off? Because it was so boring in the New Age, you know. It's like saying Eckankar has become the number one thing. Well, Eckankar is the tiny little sliver of the New Age movement. How does it become the big dog and something else? Anyways, that's the Enneagram. So you have old pagan practices, beliefs, thoughts, and ideas. So now go back to Romans 1 for just a second here. Let's bring the Bible in. Do you have my Bible in here? All right, so I'm going to paraphrase it for the moment. When Paul is addressing in Romans 1 how, you know, God's wrath is revealed against the pagan world. Why? Because they're turning away from the God that they know created everything, suppressing the truth and righteous, and turning to what? Worshiping nature, right? Goes through this whole thought process, and Paul lays this out of what it looks like. And you see this all over the world, where people worship nature. In Hinduism, they call it bhakti. They serve the idol, they bathe the idol, they feed the idol, and on and on and on. Anyways, and now out of that practice, out of the violation of the first commandment, comes all these sexual deviancies that happens as well. So now we've gotten to the point where there's so much of the sexual deviancy in the pastorate, in the church, where people at the end, it says, who not only do these things, but applaud them as well, who are cheering for and insisting that we do so as well. We must not only drop our hang-ups about, you know, gay marriage or transgender or anything, we have to embrace, and not only that, we have to celebrate. And that's exactly what Paul's addressing. So this is what paganism looks like. So when you have major pastors, Andy Stanley, saying things like, the best Christians I know are homosexuals, the most faithful people I know. I just transpose that. Well, let's say, you know, the drunk Christians I know are the best Christians that I know. The Christians who are stealing all the time are the best Christians I know. The murderous Christians that I know, they're the best. You see where you go. You just keep going with that logic.
So let's look at this. This is the 2022 State of Religion, and this is regarding evangelicals and this issue. 42% of evangelicals agree with statement number 27. Gender identity is a matter of choice. 46% of U.S. evangelicals agree with statement number 28. The Bible's condemnation of homosexual behavior doesn't apply today. Wow.
Well, notice that gender identity is a matter of choice, but sexual orientation is not. It's whatever's convenient.
Well, yeah, give me 5 minutes and let me change all that.
Well, I'm just saying this is what they're saying.
No, I know.
Well, and God is not omniscient either. 43% of U.S. evangelicals agree with statement number 4. God learns and adapts to different circumstances.
Yep. Situational ethics.
It's like he's the ultimate artificial intelligence program.
Exactly.
If you guys study, theology at all, the history of theology, you go back 130 years, you ran into, process theology, which is literally God is learning on the job, right?
Yeah, right.
Evolutionary thought.
Nothing new here.
That's the emerging church. That was Rob Bell,
53%, guys. Over half of evangelicals agree with statement 16. The Bible, like all sacred writings, contains helpful accounts of ancient myths, but is not literally true. That's what we were just talking about.
Yeah, Schaeffer was very prophetic in this sense.
He was.
I just wrote on the Ligonier poll, 57% of self-identified born again evangelicals do not believe Jesus is the only way. As a missionary, so I've wasted not only my whole life, but the thousands of missionaries who have lived before me, many of whom died for their faith. They wasted their lives too, because they just didn't come to this understanding of things that Jesus is one of many options.
If a typical megachurch pastor, let's say next month, decided to start a series on absolute truth.
Science fiction, I'm sorry.
This would be science fiction if it, but let's say it actually happened in the real world. Would you agree with my estimate that he probably would lose about 50% of his members over the course of that month.
Especially, Ron, as he applies it.
Yeah.
If he applies, you can say it all you want until you start applying the idea that there's absolute truth in the universe. And once he applies it to, say, morality, boom, you may be underestimating the loss there, Ron. Which is why pastors stay away from this stuff.
If something is absolutely true all the time, then I'm not going to be able to get away with half the stuff I want to get away with.
That's an old problem, isn't it?
Let's go back to practice here for a minute, because this is very troublesome to me, and I know it is to Bill as well, and we see it. We talk about it out there at pagan conventions we go to, the Parliament of World Religions, New Age fairs. We expect that to be there. We have in the church things like word faith teachers, which to me is no different than Wicca, because they are spell casting. The spoken word causes the universe to change and conform to your will, your spell and incantation. That's the same as Wicca. Or Richard Rohr, we've talked about Richard Rohr, who not only brought in the Enneagram, but launched to a higher degree contemplative prayer. And we were just at Paganization.
Yeah.
One of the workshops I attended was the shaman journeying. Now, it doesn't mean they're actually going any place physically. They're preparing you to go on a spiritual journey while you remain in your chair. And she says, as she's explaining what you need to do, that if you've ever done contemplative meditation, you already know how to do this. And I raised my hand and I said, what if we run into like an evil spirit along the way? And she said, you don't have to worry about that because you'll have a spirit guide. I said, well, how do you know you can trust a spirit guide? She goes, well, if you yell out help, only good spirit guides come, not evil. And I thought about that, and I made a contact with a couple of former New Agers, and I said, here's what she said. They go, oh, yeah, Richard Foster says the same thing.
Yeah.
And
it actually predates Foster. It predates Richard Rohr. You look back at Thomas Keating. You can look at David Sandal Ras, who was at the Parliament of World Religions in 1993, the head of the Benedictine order. And Alan Watts, they have Anglican guy, and you can find so many Catholics, Thomas Merton being the best and the biggest example of all this, bringing this Zen Buddhist / contemplative prayer / some version of medieval Catholicism into the church, which then gets baptized into Richard Foster, into the Protestant world, and off it goes. And at my seminary, Denver Seminary, one of my interns talked about the fact that one of my professors, who will be, I'll just give you his initials, Bruce Demarest. Bruce Demarest brought I can't.
Could you be more specific? Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Okay.
I have to be so subtle here. Bruce brought in, I can't ever pronounce it. I don't know if it's Thais or Thais. I'm not sure how to say it, but the monks, the Thais monks or Thais monks, however you're supposed to say that properly, from France, basically Buddhists. And they came in and they put candle flames, they turned off all the lights. This is at Denver, what's still legally known as Conservative Baptist Theological Seminary. They turned off all the lights, they lit candles, and they chanted for a half hour, "Come Lord Jesus, come Lord Jesus, come Lord Jesus, come Lord Jesus." And my intern comes out of there crying his eyes out. He is so upset. He's ready to, just have a massive hissy fit. And he calls me up to tell me what we went through. Well, this is where Bruce Demarest had gone. And Bruce was one of my main teachers. I was a systematic theology professor. Him and Gordon Lewis. He was systematic theology. I was a major. He was the teacher. Excuse me. And he won prizes from Christianity Today for writing this whole move into contemplative prayer. And he did a seminar as a teacher emeritus, and I went to it. And there's a lot of faculty and other people at Denver didn't like me anyway, so I didn't say anything during the seminar itself. But he actually did, I thought, a fairly good job of talking about theological problems of St. John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, all these different characters from the medieval world that are having sex with God, and these anchorite people. So I went up to him after. I waited in line, tried to wait patiently. I got up to Dr. Demarest, who you have to know him. He's a very soft-spoken man. He would just talk about, my teacher, F.F. Bruce. He would say that every 5 minutes in class. But I learned a lot from Dr. Demarest. I get up there. I've known him for 35 years at this point. I go up to ask him a question. I said, Dr. Demarest, I really appreciate you. I think you did a good job outlaying some of the problems within the medieval mystics and stuff like that. And he told the group, he said, after laying out the problems, he says, but we have to get past the mind and explore the heart. So I said, so I'm curious that you didn't bring up Thomas Merton. And he started yelling. And I've known Demarest forever. Well, I've learned more with these people. I've grown more spiritual in the last 6 months than I did in 30 years as an evangelical. And I'm like, whoa. And in my head, I'm going, because I'm not going to fight him in front of everybody. You've grown so much spiritually that you can yell at one of your students who is being respectful and kind to you, who asked a question.
What was that was the extent of your question?
Why didn't you bring up Thomas Merton?
That's all you said?
That's all I said.
And why do you think he blew up? I mean, for those who don't know the significance of your question, how would you explain
Well,
that?
Merton was probably the best known of all of the Catholic monastic movement who had fully embraced Buddhism in the 1940s and 50s.
Yep.
He wrote numerous letters to his friends, even though he's a member of this, monastic order. He's really a Zen Buddhist, and he talked quite openly about that. So in his many books, before he gets killed, becomes one with the Buddha consciousness, I guess. Before that all happens in the early 62, somewhere in there, he had helped promote this ideas. And all these other guys, David Steindl-Rast and a host of other Catholic writers, look at Merton as the one showing the way. Yep. He's the one that showed us how to mix Catholicism and Zen in particular.
Now, when I was at the seminary I worked at for between 5 and 6 years, the registrar, we had a new registrar. I don't know how long she was there. I would leave within a few months. She had a framed picture of Thomas Merton in a teaching or praying position on the credenza, if I recall correctly, behind her desk. So I knew she was really into she was an instructor. She was hired to not only be a registrar but also an instructor at the seminary. So,
Ron, I'm surprised she did not have that stylish picture of the Cuban assassin right up there next to her, with the beret and the whole bit.
What do you mean, the Cuban assassin? I'm sorry.
Well, he bragged about killing over 1,100 people. So
Che Guevara.
Che Guevara, yeah. I mean,
well,
half my teachers at DU and I have Che Guevara.
I have stories about that too. It'll be a different person. Thanks a lot.
Now we did an article, by the way, and I'll put it in the description panel below. Thomas Merton, the contemplative dark thread, so that people can learn more about him.
Right. Well, like I said, Richard Rohr, I had professors at DU, and I believe Dr. Demarest was going down there as well, going to his retreat centers to get one with God, one with the Christ of the universe. And this is back in the 90s. All right. So here's all these years. And Gordon Lewis, who Don and I both know well, I don't know if you knew him, Ron, but Gordon was one of the co-founders of EMNR along with Walter Martin. And Gordon told me, I think it was 1994, he was really worried about the direction that Bruce was going. And I didn't understand what he meant back then, but many years later, I get it. Okay, I see where Dr. Demarest had gone. And, I will always appreciate Dr. Demarest. In some sense, he turned me on to The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which I've always really appreciated, and all this kind of fun stuff. But he is moving away. And if you know the anchorites and who those people were, so bizarre, but that's the Catholic, leaders, because they're all doing mindless meditation. They're having oneness with God. They don't need the gospel. And so here we get to the Buddhist movement, which is the most aggressive attack on the mind that's ever existed in my mind. Zen especially is the most aggressive attack on the mind that God gave us. And it's purposefully that way. To quote Shankara, the great Hindu teacher, or to quote several of the Yogacar or several Buddhist leaders, the mind's only purpose is to show you the mind is good for nothing.
Right.
They're very open about that type of stuff until they're talking to Western Christian audiences who don't know any better. Then they change it. But now, like I said, this kind of chanting and stuff like this, the Richard Rohr inspired chants and all these others, this stuff's been around forever too. Buddhism's 500-600 years old. By the time Jesus says, when you pray, do not pray like the Gentiles, like the ethnos, like those guys pray, who think by their many mumblings, that they'll be heard. The idea that mindless chanting somehow engages with the divine, doing spells, spell casting, all these different things. That stuff's thousands of years old, and yet here it is in the church.
Right.
And
and you were mentioning tarot cards, and someone go, "What are you talking about tarot cards?" Well, they're called destiny cards. But
destiny cards. Yep.
Right.
And Bill Johnson, the heretic that's allegedly a pastor at Bethel Church, Bill Johnson's written an entire book about this subject, that all these, what we would have called New Age 30, 40, 50 years ago, all these practices, tarot cards, crystals, aroma therapy, zillions of other things like this, all of these things were kidnapped, as it were, by those evil pagans, because they were all in the Bible. And so what we are now doing is bringing them back into the fold as authentic Christian spiritual experiences. And so it's not a bad thing to do the same thing the pagans do. And the fact that the Bible seems to condemn divination, that's just old school. We don't need that verse. That verse was not inspired.
Right. And that's Old Testament. And as Andy Stanley pointed out, we need to disconnect.
Yeah, decouple the Old Testament, right.
Yeah,
it just gets in the way of so much.
It just does. So now you're going to be, again, we have to mention this again so people are aware. Yes. You and I and a number of others are going to be at the Engage 2023, the Cost of Failed Discipleship Conference in Tallahassee, Florida, April 28 and 29. Make plans to come. Go to the emnr.org website, look at conference, and you'll get all of the details there. Doug Grothheis is going to be there. Why is that important, Mr. Bill?
Well, Doug's, in my opinion, one of the top Christian philosophers in the church, but he's just a darn good thinker. And before he finished his PhD, he wrote a series of very good books on the New Age itself and what the New Agers were doing back in the 80s, when the New Age was really starting to take off culturally. It had been around forever, but it was really starting to take off in the 1980s. It's on the cover of Time and Newsweek and Life magazine and stuff. Like Shirley MacLaine's on TV every other day.
Yeah.
Channelers are everywhere, and all the Sally Jessy Raphael and Oprah. Everybody's got a channeler on, speaking to ancient spirits and stuff like this. So Doug was one of the early really good, sharp Christian minds who was addressing this issue, because Doug recognizes, as we're all talking about here 25 years later, that ideas don't respect walls. They don't respect buildings. They come wherever the people go. And so these ideas start coming into the church. And in my seminar about this, Don, I bring up a host of everything from the Frankfurt School to Robert Schuller to a whole bunch of Shankara Hindu and all these Buddhists, all these things coming together, and they're in the Christian church. You have people quoting them. You have people advocating for, boy, we need to get back to the wisdom of Paul Marcuse. And what? Oh my gosh,
really?
You guys ever lived? But like I said, this is the state of the modern church. We have so little discernment, and when you call this stuff out, of course, you're an evil, racist, homophobic, racist, fascist, fascist. Fill in the blank with all the adjectives you are.
And for me, that's easy. Everyone who's listened to us very much knows I already have my line for this. You might be right. I could be all of those things. But the question is, am I wrong? And show me where I'm wrong.
But what they're doing now, and of course, I'm not saying you should change your approach, but what they're doing now is they're saying your very question, the very fact that you're asking that, shows how evil you are, or bigoted, misogynist, homophobic, whatever.
Yeah.
The very fact that you're requiring an objective answer,
response, a defense,
right. Yeah. Because we all know that objective truth is
white.
White supremacist, capitalist, white Christian nationalism.
Nobody ever cared about truth until white people came along and used it as a tool of oppression.
I want to slow down just for a moment, because we're talking about issues in the church, and I want to make sure that we're not painting all pastors up as just, not doing their job. Because although many pastors are not, they're more concerned with getting more bodies in to sneak up on them with the gospel and add to their, sort of multi-level marketing downline, let's say. There are many pastors, usually small churches, that have a really difficult job. They're trying to do their teaching regularly. They're trying to disciple their people. They're doing the visiting. They're doing all the work of the pastoral calling. And yet they don't have as much control, because their people are getting more information outside of the church and bringing it in. So they're getting it from, quote, Christian publishers, and they're getting books like the Road Back to You from InterVarsity Press,
Yeah.
and other books from other supposedly Christian publishers, and reading them without the pastor realizing it. Or they're picking it up on YouTube videos and they're imbibing on it. And so the pastor kind of gets snuck up on, if you will, with false teaching, and it's permeating the church before he even realizes it's there.
Here's a sad story of that, Don. So Mark Roggeman, one of my ministry partners at Haven Ministries, Mark was a Democrat for 39 years, very sharp, brilliant on small cults you've never heard of. And Mark and I were going to a New Age psychic fair here in town, and one of the New Age bookstores, Mark actually knew the lady that owned it. He had talked to her before, and she had a couple hundred books laid out on the table. And right in the middle of all these books is the Prayer of Jabez. And two things out of this whole story. So Mark says, "Isn't that a Christian book? Why is it in your bookshelves?" And she goes, "Oh, it's wonderful. I read every book I, get to keep my people safe." And I'm like, "Oh man, I can't even tell you how many bad books are in Christian bookstores."
Yeah.
And then she said something else interesting. She goes, "I didn't know you guys believed in those kind of prayers too," as in her. So I write an article critical of the Prayer of Jabez and Wilkerson's whole approach to things, which is, really laid out on his website, even more in the book. And boy, did I get some hate mail back from Christians, people I've known for years. One pastor told me, "I just gave a copy to every single member of my church." Oh, great.
Yeah.
So why are you saying this kind of stuff? So I have to go through, why I'm saying this kind of stuff. But and that was what, when did that book come out? 20 years ago?
Oh, yeah.
25.
Maybe even longer, 25 years ago. Yeah. I mean, we have all these things happening, and you're right, Don. I am certainly not picking on pastors in this respect. Some of my best friends are pastors. Is that the requisite line?
Wasn't the Prayer of Jabez promoted by James Dobson?
I would not be surprised.
I mean, I thought
Guys,
among others, yes.
Yeah. It's, again, in his defense, Wilkerson was basically saying, "Well, I'm not pushing word faith things." Then you go on his website and you read how to expand your portfolio, how to get more stocks and more bonds and more diamonds. And I'm like, "Oh, you're not promoting wealth. How interesting. Your website seems to speak otherwise." Again, I'm not trying to speak that all pastors are like this or think like this, but we live in a non-discerning age. And Don, this goes back to our whole Willow Creek thing from way back when.
Right.
When the pastor becomes CEO and not pastor, CEO job is to expand his market share. A pastor's job is to teach his flock. And if you teach them true things, you might decrease your market share.
Right.
Hence the church down the street. I was a youth pastor for several years before I became a missionary. If your youth group is teaching the word of God and, going through these boring Bible studies, and people might actually be growing or whatever, but that pastor down the street, the youth pastor down the street, he's got 200 kids showing up and they're having a great time. And boy, the elders or the stockholders of my church will go, "Hey, why aren't we doing," it's that whole mindset, this Peter Drucker inspired mindset, that we have to build our market shares. So we have to take a business model to the church. So now you're a small pastor, you can get away with this for the most part. But if you're building a large corporation, a large mega church, you're not going to talk about divisive stuff that's going to maybe cut out your market share. You'll lose your job.
Well, the one of the mantras of the 80s, especially during the church growth movement, was, we're supposed to be fishers of men, but you have to find the right bait for the hook.
Uh-huh.
And others would point out the fact that, the apostles didn't catch fish that way. They threw out a net. And that was, in their minds, that's what it meant to be a fisherman. That's what they would have applied to being a fisher of men. The net doesn't, it's simply whoever's there, whichever fish are there when the net is cast, are going to get caught in the net. But not all of them did get caught in the net. Everybody knew that. Some of them found a way around it.
And then you have the Apostle Paul, kind of the consummate missionary to cults and non-Christian religions.
There you go.
Going into the Areopagus, and he used their material to get them to the place of, here's who the guy is you really need to know, this Jesus.
Yeah. So my point, though, is that, it's not up to us to bait the hook. The hook is the message.
Right.
The bait is man-made, something added,
Right.
So if they go for the hook, well, of course we don't use hooks, we use nets, and that's the proclamation of the gospel. Whoever's hearing it.
That's good.
Well, like I said, there's 1,000 pagan streams that have been flowing into the church and have for a long time. You know, it was very early in church experience that the Gnostic stream comes pouring in, right? And Jesus wasn't really a human being, and off that goes. And then you get the Arius reaction. No, he was really basically a big, super large human being, a demigod, but not really God. This has been a fight for the church forever. And by the time you get to medieval Catholicism, they're basically practicing Buddhists, as far as I'm concerned. And, you know, then the Reformation stomps a lot of that nonsense out. But, you know, guess what comes back in the last 100 years? Chardin is a Hindu, you know, mystic, and Thomas Merton is a Zen Buddhist, and Alan Watts is a Zen Buddhist. And, you know, this stuff just comes flooding in through official church channels, as it were.
But it seems so familiar, you know.
Because it is. It has to be around.
Yes,
The Bible doesn't have to be very unique.
Yeah,
We're such morons. Keep
all right,
believing
guys,
things
we're
lie.
going to start wrapping it up here.
What?
Yeah, well, you know,
He's just getting rolling.
I just
I
wanna
was
make-
just part of the illusion, Don. It's all Maya.
in the last few days, I've had a couple of pastors contact us, just excited about a couple of things. They became aware of Holly Pivik's and Doug Yvette's book on the New Apostolic Reformation, and one of them
good.
read it and taught on it from the pulpit.
Very good.
Then got a copy of our book, and he read it in one day. He said, so they want to look
Whoa.
at doing some conferences and that sort of thing to help other churches in their area be aware of this stuff. So some pastors are coming to life on this. We need to pray for them.
Well, and there's always been good pastors. You know, Irenaeus, you know, gets hated by certain people, but here he is, the bishop, and he is talking about the Gnostic heresies that are all over the place. And I'm sure there are people saying, how dare you criticize my favorite teacher, Cerinthus, or whatever. Too bad they're not of God. So it's
Ron,
the same
would you
phenomenon
share-
today.
Everyone watching this, think about going to the M&R conference. Ron,
Yay.
walk us out of here, please.
Okay, let's give credit to whom credit is due. Our resident cult leader profiler is Kneel Before Me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Culinary services are provided by Chef Ham and Cheese. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and D Opposer. Our Mormon Archives manager is Polygamous. Our Liberal Denominations Bureau Chief is Lucy Goosey. Transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur. Special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys, Ode to Humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Jolie Pulling. Technical assistance comes through Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham and Howe. Grievance Resolution Director is Giovanna Pisami. Director of Privacy Assurance is Wiretapping. And original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions. Both of them are solely responsible for this content, although you will never be able to prove that in a court of law.
Never happened.
Stand in line, but nobody's done it. So, all right. Thank